Thank you for viewing this video. My name is Mike Gimbel. I would like to start by giving congratulations on the Workers' World Party successful national conference that took place this past weekend. I'm a strong supporter of Workers' World Party, but I am not a member. What I say here is my views alone. I recommend, however, everyone to check out the Workers' World Party website at workers.org. I hope that you have also viewed my previous video entitled A Call for Unity amongst Marxist Leninists. This is, in a sense, a follow-up video going into some background issues that have, unfortunately, divided our movement. The overthrow of the Soviet Union was the greatest defeat for the working class in history. The Soviet Union went from a backwards, almost totally illiterate and mostly peasant country to become the second most powerful military and second most powerful economic force on the planet in just a few decades. But the difficult circumstances of its birth in a backwards, illiterate peasant country that was under constant threat of war and invasion and economic blockade led to the development of a conservative and privileged bureaucracy that hindered the Soviet Union's internal social development and led to its eventual overthrow. While it existed, and even somewhat to this day, the Soviet Union was an inspiration to the workers and the oppressed the world over, as it became more and more powerful and inspired more and more people to revolutionary action. While the Soviet Union existed, the working class and the oppressed benefited all over the world, including here in the United States. With the overthrow of the Soviet Union has come a vicious counterattack by the capitalists on all the gains won by the workers and the oppressed while the Soviet Union existed. Our class has been put on the defensive all over the globe. We see unions being destroyed and the social safety net being torn apart, and imperialist wars of reconquest in the former colonial world. In my union, I recently had a short conversation with an immigrant from Nepal. He was very disappointed in the recent developments in his homeland, where the Maoist leadership has split into two rival factions, and he was sad about so much revolutionary sacrifice made by the people of Nepal, only to end with this result. He was ready to blame Marxism because, paraphrasing his words, Marxism sounds good, but reality is otherwise. This represents an understandable misunderstanding about what Marxism is. Marxism is not just some ideology. It is a method for scientific analysis and political action based on the economic and political situation, both internally in a country and based on international conditions. Nepal is not an island separate from the capitalist world, and the workers' struggle cannot be confined to Nepal's bourgeois national limits. International conditions fundamentally determine national events, particularly in an isolated and impoverished nation such as Nepal, wedged between two huge neighbors, China to the north, India to the south. Nepal is an impoverished and underdeveloped nation, whose limited industry is mostly attached to supporting the peasant economy and the products of that peasant economy. Nepal needed the economic and military support from China if this revolution was continued to move forward. That support from China, as far as I'm aware, is nowhere to be seen, simply because the Chinese Communist Party leadership is more concerned about its relations with U.S. imperialism and with India than stirring up or supporting a revolution in Nepal. This was very different from the history of Cuba. Cuba was also a small neo-colony of imperialism when Fidel Castro and Che Guevara led a revolution that overthrew the U.S.-supported dictator Fulgencio Batista. Despite the revolutionary power of that terrific, great revolution, Cuba only survives today as a workers' state because the Soviet Union, in those first few critical years, came to its aid both economically and militarily right after the revolution triumphed. Unfortunately for Nepal, it has no such protector today. It is also clear that the overthrow of the Soviet Union is the main reason that South Africa is not communist today. The South African Revolution was a great revolution, but it defeated the apartheid regime at the wrong time, unfortunately, after the overthrow of the Soviet Union. The needed international support was nowhere to be found for a communist revolution in an underdeveloped country, even a country as developed as South Africa. The examples of Nepal and South Africa, as well as the vicious imperialist wars that came after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the wars against Yugoslavia, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria, and the bombings of Yemen and Pakistan, and the U.S. overthrow of the elected government in Haiti and the occupation of Haiti are all a result of the victory of imperialism in the Cold War. The current worldwide attacks by the capitalists against labor unions and workers and the oppressed nations all over the world are all the result of the imperialist victory in the Cold War. As a result of this terrible defeat for the workers and the oppressed, due to that overthrow of the Soviet Union, we as Marxists must go back and closely examine the history that led up to that defeat. We must learn the lessons, both good and bad, especially the bad, most importantly the bad. As scientists of revolution, we must study the defeats even more than the successes. I love to quote from Mao, paraphrasing the following, quote, "In an important battle, give me a commander who's lost a battle, not one who has never lost a battle. Only a commander who has lost a battle can know what can go wrong." And that's what we need to do when we look at the revolutions that have taken place, that have been overthrown, or have had to step backwards. We as Marxists are required to examine and to explain the experiments in revolution that were made by the seizure of power by the communists in Russia and China, the two greatest events in modern human history. We must know what did go wrong so that we can avoid those same mistakes in the future. Viewing the great revolutions in the Soviet Union and in China with rose-colored glasses is the way to aid the class enemy, who will always exploit all our mistakes if we are not prepared to deal with and learn from these mistakes. We must learn from these mistakes. Much of what has been written about the Soviet Union and China has centered on the political struggles amongst the leaders. While those political struggles are very important to understand and to learn from, these political struggles cannot be understood without an understanding of the economic situation under which those political struggles took place. Political struggles are just the outward symptom of the economic problems faced by those leaders. This is the ABC of Marxism. Politics does not determine economics. Economics determines politics. And that is as true in a worker state as it is in a bourgeois state, as it was in a feudal state, and as it was in a slave state. I repeat, economics determines politics, not the other way around. Much of what I am saying here is about getting Marxists to understand why the Chinese Cultural Revolution occurred. In order to understand why the Cultural Revolution occurred, one needs to examine China's internal economy and how its economy fit into the world economy at that time. Much of what I say here can also be applied to understanding the defeat of the left and the triumph of the conservative and privileged Soviet bureaucracy in Russia in the 1920s. Both Russia and China were poor peasant countries at the time of the seizure of power by communist parties. These worker states were created in countries with a small minority of workers and a huge majority of peasants. The majority of peasants are petty bourgeois small landholders, not workers. Working class parties in Russia and China liberated the peasants from the oppressions of the big landlords. But Marxists understand that the peasants represent a different class which posed enormous economic problems and political problems for the workers, led by communist parties who wanted to bring Russia and China industrially into the modern world. Small peasant landholdings and the breakup of the large landed estates after the revolution are a negative problem for the development of the economy. Small plots of land are far less efficient than larger plots where science and technology can be better used on those larger plots. Both revolutions electrified the poor, the oppressed, and the workers all over the globe, leading to many attempted revolutions and the creation of a powerful working class upsurge all over the globe during much of the 20th century. It is no accident that the labor movement in the United States has risen and fallen with the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. However, both of these great revolutions, as I said before, were in countries with a mostly backwards economy as compared to the highly developed capitalist economies led by U.S. imperialism. After the 1917 revolution in Tsarist Russia, the Bolsheviks knew that the revolution in Germany was critically important to Russia's economic development, simply because that was where the most highly developed and skilled working class and capitalist economy in Europe was located. When the German Revolution failed to materialize in October of 1923, a huge political swing to the right took place in the Soviet Union, based on the disappointment over the failure of the German Revolution. An attitude of reactionary nationalism, fostered by the new, young, privileged, and conservative Soviet bureaucracy, decided to reject the basic idea of the Russian Revolution as it was enshrined in the creation of the Third International. The conservative and privileged Soviet bureaucracy rejected the likelihood of any revolution in the West and made the decision to rely solely on the internal capacity of the new revolutionary regime to create socialism on its own. However, no nation is an island, whether it be Russia or China or Nepal, and the very concept of nationhood is bourgeois. Yes, a fundamental political demand of the communist movement is for self-determination of oppressed nationalities, but that is not the same thing as promoting bourgeois nationalism. The revisionist theory of socialism in one country was a repudiation of world revolution and a repudiation of the Third International created by Lenin and Trotsky. As the revolutionary enthusiasm in Russia began to wane after the 1923 defeat in Germany, we saw by the 30s the unfortunate entry of the Soviet Union into the League of Nations in 1936, also known as the League of Capitalist Thieves. The entry into the League of Nations occurred at the same time as the tragic executions in the Soviet Union of almost all the remaining members of Lenin's comrades that had worked with him in making the 1917 revolution, and this period truly marked the end of the revolutionary period inside the Soviet Union. Rather than world revolution, in 1936, peaceful coexistence became the main slogan of the conservative Soviet bureaucracy, as it tried to help the USSR, the Soviet Union, survive in an extremely hostile capitalist environment. All the political twists and turns of that conservative Soviet bureaucracy were based upon the economic and military isolation of the new workers' state in that hostile and dangerous capitalist-dominated world. That economic and military isolation was unfortunately made into the fetish of self-reliance and a belief that socialism could develop and survive while isolated in a sea of capitalist vultures. Unfortunately, under these conditions of isolation imposed on the new revolutionary regime by the capitalist thieves and vultures, a police-state methods of bureaucratic control replaced the optimism of world revolution. All criticism by the left in the Soviet Union, and really internationally too, of the mistakes of the conservative bureaucracy was suppressed. Diplomacy geared to national survival for the Soviet Union replaced the idea of world revolution that had been exemplified originally by the creation by Lenin and Trotsky of the Third International. Bureaucratic caste cynicism replaced the revolutionary enthusiasm of the workers. In the Soviet Union, the workers unfortunately became politically separated from their own government as a result. Bourgeois diplomacy replaced the revolutionary diplomacy of the early years of the revolution. I could go on and on, but I will skip over the disastrous agreement at Yalta, and the unfortunate entry of the Soviet Union into the thieves-run United Nations, and get right to the economic background now for the Chinese Cultural Revolution. That essentially follows from what I've already outlined. This background, I believe, is critical to the understanding of what occurred in China. The Chinese communists came to power in 1949 in a great revolution. However, China was, in relation to world imperialism at that time, even less economically developed than was the Soviet Union in 1917. In addition, there was another critical difference. The Russian Revolution was led by the industrial workers, especially those centered in St. Petersburg. Not so in China. In China, the Communist Party was driven out of the cities during 1927's mass slaughter of communists by the Kuomintang regime, and by necessity became based in the peasant countryside just for survival, and had only come to power in China in 1949 after a civil war lasting 22 years. As different from and also as different from Tsarist Russia. Tsarist Russia, even though it was very weak and backward, was the least powerful imperialist country. Whereas China was a neo-colony. China had defeated a neo-colonial comprador regime that depended for its backing on the imperialist powers. In other words, the Chinese Red Army had been the instrument of national self-determination, not strictly a workers' seizure of power, as was the case in Tsarist Russia. The fact that this war of national liberation was led by a communist workers' party gave the party the opportunity to lead China on the socialist path. What actually gave China a better chance for building socialism than had been the case for the Bolsheviks, was the ability to get the economic assistance of the Soviet Union. Whereas the USSR was denied that assistance when the revolution failed to materialize in Germany in 1923. Unfortunately for the new Chinese leadership, the Soviet Union had long since turned to the right politically after the hope for revolution in Germany had failed to occur. And this would have tragic results for China and especially for the worldwide Marxist-Leninist movement. The problem for China and the world's revolution movement was that the conservative Soviet bureaucracy, under its isolation in this dangerous world that existed at that time, had more faith in bourgeois diplomacy than in revolutionary alliances, including the alliance with China. From the moment around 1950, right after the 49 revolution was victorious, up to the Cultural Revolution began in the mid-60s, there was a constant tension between the two countries' leaderships. The tension was based on the conservative Soviet bureaucracy's attempts at peaceful coexistence with Western imperialism that had emanated from the bourgeois nationalism inherent in socialism in one country. The Soviet bureaucracy desired so greatly to break the USSR's economic and military isolation, but they tried to do it through the illusion of diplomatic means, which could not have been, it had no chance of success, but that's where the bureaucracy was focused on. This diplomacy was viewed as more important to the survival of the Soviet Union than the risky support of revolution, including support for China. The conservative Soviet bureaucracy did not understand the importance of industrializing and modernizing China that it had for the very survival of the Soviet Union, especially since it required a huge financial investment into China by the Soviet Union, which they would have preferred to invest in the Soviet Union itself, who was just recovering from the mass slaughter and destruction of World War II. The conservative Soviet bureaucracy was also not so enthusiastic when it came to supporting the revolutionary enthusiasm of the new Chinese communist leadership, since, as I said, did not coincide with the efforts at peaceful coexistence with imperialism. At the same time as the conservative Soviet bureaucracy was trying to get these agreements with U.S. led imperialism, U.S.-led imperialism was militarily and economically trying to strangle China. There was this huge contradiction on the planet between the military and economic confrontation with China, led by the United States, and the constant and foolhardy appeals from Moscow for peaceful coexistence and détente with U.S. imperialism. As a result, China was caught in a political, military, and economic vice. In order to economically develop, it desperately needed Soviet economic aid for its industrial development. But at the same time as the U.S. was economically and militarily blockading China, the Soviet leadership was desperately seeking military treaties with the U.S. so as to lessen the constant military threats against the Soviet Union. And we can't forget about that was constant. But they were doing that while virtually ignoring those same threats to China. This tension from this contradiction between the USSR and China increased day by day during the 1950s. Since China was daily facing a nuclear war threat from the US, it decided it needed to begin a process of developing its own nuclear deterrence. And this became the opening wedge whereby the Soviet Union would eventually and disastrously, for both China and the Soviet Union, to break off economic relations with China. The conservative Soviet bureaucracy viewed China's decision to develop its own nuclear deterrence as a threat to its diplomatic efforts to obtain that illusory peaceful coexistence that it had been seeking for 2 decades, since the mid-1930s. Peaceful coexistence is an illusion. It's an impossibility because the opposing classes, capitalists and worker, exist and are in constant mortal combat. This is the ABC of Marxism. As time passed, this conservative Soviet bureaucracy became more and more alarmed by the U.S. military confrontation with China, and the Chinese leadership became more and more alarmed by the actions and statements of the Soviet leadership. One should therefore view the great leap forward in 1958 China and the efforts by China to develop a nuclear weapon at that time in this historical context. Shortly thereafter, in the period of 1960 to 1961, the Soviet Union withdrew its economic aid to China. Half-built factories littered China. The factories begun with Soviet aid would never see a single item produced. This withdrawal of economic aid must be viewed as one of the greatest traitorous acts in the history of the working class movement. It is the same thing as one union crossing another union's picket line. At that very moment, the internal political struggle inside the Chinese Communist Party that ultimately led to the Cultural Revolution must have broken out after the withdrawal of Soviet economic aid. Internal Communist Party factions would have been forced to debate the question of how to economically develop China under this new situation. These types of factional debates always take place at turning points in history as leaders try to figure out what direction to go in under the new circumstances. Inevitably, with all the economic aid from the Soviet Union cut off, a faction of the Chinese Communist Party would almost immediately have come to the conclusion of opening up China to capitalist investments as the only way to develop China industrially under these new conditions. The conservative Soviet bureaucracy, by cutting off economic aid to China, was unwittingly forcing China on the road to accommodation with U.S. imperialism. By doing so, they were weakening, not strengthening, the economic and military strength of the Soviet Union itself, and further isolating the Soviet Union. What a disastrous decision. With this as background, one can readily see the unfortunate position this put the Chinese revolutionaries in. The left wing of the Chinese Communist Party, led by Lin Biao and supported by Mao, had to argue against going down the road of capitalist investment, but not having an alternative proposal other than self-reliance due to the withdrawal of their economic aid. As a result, the Chinese Cultural Revolution was a desperate attempt to hold back those entering the capitalist road. But economics determines politics, and the capitalist roaders were victorious. One note. Some say that the defeat of the communists in Indonesia in 1965 was what decided the battle between the left and right inside the Chinese Communist Party. They compare it to the failure of the German Revolution's effect on the Soviet Communist Party. The two situations, Germany in 1923 and Indonesia in 1965, are not comparable. Yes, the mass slaughter of the left in Indonesia was a huge defeat for the left all over the world, and especially in China, and especially for the left wing in China, and did have a bigger political effect inside of China in that struggle. But that's where the comparison ends. The loss of Germany in 1923 was an economic catastrophe for the Soviet Union's new revolution, even more than it was a political catastrophe. Germany, unlike Indonesia, completely unlike Indonesia, was a highly developed capitalist economy, the most highly developed in Europe. A victory for a revolution in Germany would have meant a catastrophic defeat for capitalism all over the world. The Soviet Union, aligned with Germany, with capitalist Germany now becoming communist, would have been a powerhouse combination that would have likely led to a worldwide communist revolution. The failure of the German Revolution in 1923 changed world history by saving capitalism from that worldwide collapse. when looking at the economy of Indonesia in the early to mid-1960s, this was a country that was even less developed than the already economically isolated China. If a successful revolution had occurred in Indonesia, it would have required the economic and military aid from China, not the other way around. The Soviet Union, not China, would have been turned to by a victorious Indonesian revolution for its economic support, for its industrial development, not Beijing. Yes, the left in China would have been temporarily strengthened by a successful Indonesian revolution. But even the belief that such a revolution was coming in Indonesia was no sure thing. The massive, huge Indonesian Communist Party was itself split, with probably a majority favoring its alliance with Moscow, not Beijing. Economically, a successful revolution in Indonesia would have, of necessity, looked to Moscow, not Beijing, for economic and even military support. So where does that leave us today in this worldwide situation after the overthrow of the Soviet Union? Where does this leave us politically today on this, in this difficult situation? Now, while there is a wonderful shift to the left in Latin America, let's not fool ourselves. The socialism in Latin America is understandably, under the current world situation, under the unfortunate world situation, more a wish than a reality. Even in great revolutionary Venezuela. All Marxists need to defend the efforts of the Latin American left, especially defense of Venezuela. But we cannot be blind to the fact that the reason that the left in Latin America is being so cautious, despite so many successes, is due to the fact that the Soviet Union no longer exists. They too must survive in a capitalist world dominated by a sea of capitalist vultures. This is today's reality, and that all Marxists must take into account. Elsewhere in the world, outside of Latin America, our class is on the defensive everywhere. But still, we remain optimistic and truly confident. Why do we remain optimistic and confident under these dire circumstances? We are optimistic and confident because the capitalist economy has hit a brick wall. The capitalists cannot solve their economic problems. There is no way forward for them. Robots cannot buy goods produced in these new high-tech factories. The Internet's very efficiencies describe the capitalist market. High-tech requires fewer workers at lower pay to produce fabulous quantities of goods that cannot be sold because the workers are the capitalist market for their goods. And those workers either are not employed, or if they're employed, don't have the money to buy the goods. And the goods are being produced at a fabulously more efficient quantity. The capitalists, as a result, are destroying their own marketplace. By doing so, they are forcing the world down the path of revolution just for our own survival. We are going to have to deal with this situation one way or another. They realize it sooner, we realize it, the better. But that's why I'm so, and we should be so, confident and optimistic about the road ahead, despite the defensive posture of the working class movement worldwide. It is because the capitalist road ahead is blocked. Our road is opening wider and wider day by day. But we cannot take that road as long as the workers do not believe in their own power. And right now they don't believe in their own power. The problem for revolutionaries is how to recreate an international Marxist movement capable of reviving the workers' belief in their own class's power. How do we get the workers to regain their confidence? That is the greatest issue in terms of ideology. How to restore the workers' belief in the power of their own class. And that restoration of worker belief in their own power as a class cannot be fostered by scattered and sectarian Marxist-Leninist parties that cannot cooperate due to sectarian issues inherited from the past. And only a Marxist-Leninist party leading the workers in struggle can restore workers' confidence in their own powers. It can only be a Marxist-Leninist party, but they're scattered in all these sectarian groupings. We live at a turning point in history where capitalism has hit a brick wall. But no successful communist revolution is likely until the leaders of our class, the Marxist-Leninists, begin to focus on the process of dialogue to create a unified Marxist-Leninist movement. The workers all over the world are looking for leadership and not finding it. Yes, in some countries it's more developed in bigger struggles and more larger Marxist-Leninist groups that are fighting, but that's not sufficient. This sectarianism must end, and this is the basic issue for our movement. This sectarianism must change, and we can and will do it. Where there is a will, there is a way. Let's start the unity dialogue that will lead to united action, the action that the working class needs in this crisis. We can change the world. We've done it in the past. Capitalism has hit a wall and can't solve its problems. And the road is opening for us, and our class needs us. Our class is suffering under a withering attack by the capitalists all over the world, ever since they won the Cold War and overthrew the Soviet Union. Will we put our sectarian history to one side and begin that dialogue? I believe that we will begin that dialogue. We will begin that dialogue because there is no other choice. But the sooner, the better we begin, the better every will be in this struggle. The workers and the oppressed are taking a humongous beating. But we have the ability to turn this situation around precisely because the capitalist class is trapped in an unsolvable worldwide economic crisis. They can't get out of it. So let's do it. Let's get organized. Let's get the dialogue started. Let's build a unified Marxist-Leninist movement. Right. The victory to the workers and the oppressed. Power to the people. Victory to the workers and the oppressed. Power to the people. That ends this, but I want to add one thing. If you have not viewed my previous video that I posted on YouTube, which is entitled A Call for Unity Amongst Marxist-Leninists, please do so, and please share these two videos as widely as possible. Thank you.